types of events aren't possible. We have Rally Software, Salesforce.com, GenCon, and McAfee. I think all of them anyways, have representatives here tonight. We also have Miki Tokola and Chris Sakas here with us tonight from the Product Development and Management Association, also known as PDMA. They help develop and market this event as well. And I also want to thank you for the PDMA's collaboration. We hope to do some more with them in the future as well. So now on to the panel discussion. I want to introduce Ben Sherwood here without further ado. Ben?
Thanks so much, Steve. Hi, my name is Ben Sherwood, and I am a software developer here in the Portland area, and I'm also on the TAO Developers Steering Committee. And we love putting on events like this throughout the year, just educational sessions to tickle one's fancy and get a lot of product management, marketing, software developers, anyone involved. It's all good. So tonight, the discussion is supposed to end at about 8:10, and then throughout that, we're hoping to have a Q&A session potentially, but then also there's going to be Q&A at the end as well as the event. So don't necessarily hold your questions to the end. And then also, this involves wine, free wine, so you want to pay attention. I'm going to read this word by word. Towards the end of the event, please take a moment to fill out an event survey, which can be found in the center of your table. We take the feedback very seriously and use the information to create future events that are of interest to you. Make sure you place your name on the survey, as we will collect the forms and draw a bottle of free wine at the end of the event. So please fill those out. Hopefully pens and papers out there. Now, this kind of reminds me of the story of tonight's event. This last summer, I was driving around my little nephew, Wyatt is his name, he's 5 years old, in Portland. And we're driving along, it's a warm summer evening, and all of a sudden there's a convertible in front of us. And the convertible stops at the stop sign, and this woman stands up and she waves, the convertible top is open, and she waves and she's stark naked. And I couldn't believe it. And then all of a sudden from the back I hear Wyatt, Uncle Ben, that woman, she's not wearing a seatbelt. So tonight, the moral is all about perspectives. What you bring to the table, what these guys bring to the table, we're going to learn a lot tonight. So please, let's welcome Jeff Kruger, who is a fantastic gentleman with the Lex Forum Exchange. He's with Get Kruger. Please welcome Jeff.
Hi, glad you guys were able to make it. I'd like to have the panelists come up. Take their seat. So as both Skip and Ben said, this event is being put on jointly between the Technology Association of Oregon and the PDMA. Nash is the new president of the PDMA. So when we go through our quick introductions, I'll have him give the plug as to what PDMA really does here. So, the microphone's not? Okay. How's that? Okay, so the gist of this event really is how do you reconcile planning or pragmatic planning and functioning with Agile, software development, product development in an Agile fashion. Many times those things are hard to reconcile against each other. So with that said, I'm just going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to seed the first couple of questions. And as we get rolling, feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or something to interject, and I'll call on you. Proceed in that fashion. So, again, my name is Jeff Kruger. I've led the Technology Leadership Exchange for the TAO for the past 3.5 years, and I'm a consultant in the industry in the areas of product management, product planning, marketing, strategic positioning, and things like that. So, with that said, I'm going to pass the microphone and have each person introduce.
All right, my name is Dave Patterson. I'm a senior Agile software engineering quality leader. Been involved with Agile since 2004 when I got my certification, and help the team move to Scrum and XP.
Hi there, my name is Justin Berger. I'm a technical development supervisor at ADP, and I run a team of approximately 30 developers, equally split between Portland, Oregon, and Hyderabad, India.
Hi everyone, I'm Dorian Simpson. I run a boutique consulting firm called Planning Innovations. We wrote the white paper that you might have seen as you come in. Just pick one up on the way out, if you haven't. We focus on product innovation and planning, training, and consulting. And I live Agile because I put my company name in print on my card.
Thanks, Dorian. Good evening, everybody. My name is David Nash. I'm VP of Product Management at ADP Dealer Services. I work with Justin. Little different groups, but we're neighbors. Two quick things. First off, thanks Jeff and Skip and the TAO for partnering with PDMA tonight. Raise your hand if you're a product manager or product owner or more of a product person than a dev in the room. Just want to kind of see the audience. Well, that's terrific. You know, product managers in the Portland metro area are one underserved community, folks. And if you're a product manager, you know that, or a product owner. And the PDMA, in partnership with TAO, is all about trying to raise the practice, make it better. We are going to do our second product camp ever in Portland later this spring. Let me just give you a quick website to go visit. It's called productcamppdx.org. We don't have our new content up yet. It's still last year's stuff, but go there, bookmark it. And if you're a product manager or product owner, it's something you're not going to want to miss. It'll be later this spring, probably in the April or May timeframe. Anyway, on behalf of the PDMA, we're excited to partner with TAO tonight, and thanks for coming.
Hello, my name is Adam White. I'm a management consultant. I've been doing that for about 4 years. I've been doing Agile for since about 2004, 2005. The name of my company is SoTech Advisors, and help clients with Agile adoption and aspects of program management, and basically, when you get through the Agile adoption, figuring out how to make the most of the Agile teams that you stood up. So I mostly worked with technology leaders, but I also want to work with product management leaders. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, David, thanks for asking that polling question. I want to ask one more polling question. How many of you here, your development teams, are operating in some form of Agile right now? And how many are not?
You're the ones being honest.
Okay.
Some form.
Some form. Extreme, triple extreme, triple X. Okay, so with that, I'm just gonna start with a question, and I'm gonna ask it to all the panel members and whoever feels comfortable starting this off. We talk about a lot of times in product roadmaps, there's planned work that's being pulled from a roadmap into a backlog. Then there's unplanned work, things like patches, hot fixes, things that come out of testing, beta, and QA, and things like that. When you're pulling from the backlog into creating a iteration or a sprint, how do you reconcile the planned stuff with the unplanned stuff?
I'll start. So I think a key point to this is release planning. So you have your sprint planning, but you also have release planning, where you're specifically talking about the number of sprints, what you're going to do in those sprints. And I think it's important to have that meeting because you're going through what the product owner thinks you're going to work on. But when you get to the next release planning meeting, you can talk about what you really worked on. And it's a good way to talk about, this is the stuff you think is important, but in reality, what are all these firefighting tasks that are coming up?
So I think that gets to the crux of Agile, is both the power and the pain of Agile. Is how do you manage the exploding number of user stories, epics, and investigations going on. When you start the vision, you've got this much work, and as it goes on, you figure it out it goes this much work. And so you have to continuously go back and reprioritize releases and epics, and it is a pain in the butt. But that's the beauty and the pain of Agile, as I see it.
Yeah, planning's the operative word. Plan to have lots of garbage to clean up. You know, it's beautiful if you have a white sheet of paper and you have no technical debt, but in the real world, I have a mountain of technical debt. You know, I'll bet a bunch of you do also. So you can ignore it and never get to it, or you can, you know, tell your boss that, you know, we're going to have a couple of sprints just to clean up technical debt. In the same way, I know that's exactly what they'll do. In the same way that you'll have, you know, a couple of research spikes, you know, but plan for it because it ain't going to go away.
Yeah, I just have to say that if you have unplanned work, you expect the budget for it. You can't plan for it, you have the budget for it. But a lot of times, there's a difference between unplanned and unplannable work, and the difference is planning. So, you know, you basically look at that initial budget and see how much smaller you can make it by teaching people how to plan.
So one of the things that's not going to fly with executives is say, we're going to put the business on hold while we take care of this technical debt. That's it. I've never seen that fly anywhere. So what you have to do is you address the technical debt as you work into those areas. And as far as unplanned work versus what you've got planned, after a few iterations, you have an idea, if you don't already, about how much time, unplanned, unexpected stuff is taken away from your planned development. And so what you can do is you can allocate time for that in your iterations and in your releases, so that when those things inevitably do come up, then they don't affect the commitments that the team's made for the planned work.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then as they get through answering this next question, then feel free to start raising your hand and asking questions, or if you have a story to tell related to these first two questions as to how you've addressed this or where you've had successes or failures, don't be shy. My next question, it's similar to the first question, but it's not the same. It's related to innovation. You know, when you consider all the drivers of a product roadmap, you've got your marketplace, customers, your CS department, sales department with things that will help get new accounts, all the strategic things from the executive staff. One of the things that often gets missed is actual innovation, going beyond just what the marketplace depicts your roadmap should be, but innovation as far as what do we want to do with our solution to differentiate further from the crowd or enter new vertical markets, or how do we innovate instead of just, okay, we'll add that feature. Okay, we can get these 3 new customers if we add this feature. What about the innovation of the solution set? And how do you reconcile that and take time out to inject that into your development work? Woo.
That's a big one. It kind of gets into vision, you know. What's that? It's in my name, planning innovations. It's a big one. I struggle with it when I work with teams on Agile. When you talk about the big features, the big radical things that are going to change your position in the marketplace. You work with the Agile team, and all of a sudden everything is a 64. Like, they just can't schedule it. And you ask them to break it down further, and they just can't schedule it. The big ones are really tough. It takes a lot of collaboration and time to work through the big things that are dramatic in the product or the platform, whatever you're building. So it's frustrating as management because it's one of those things where Agile doesn't quite address it as well as it could. That's the irony of Agile. I think one of the complaints of Agile is on the big things where there's a lot of uncertainty unknown, Agile should have strength. But in some cases, if the team is more incremental thinking and focused on 2s, 4s, and 8s, you don't get the big things done. And I think that's the collaboration between management, product management, and engineering has to figure that out, is how to get the big things done and focusing on the core product. So I don't have a good answer. It's just on a case-by-case working with teams on figuring out the answer.
You know, in my experience, I've worked in a much larger company who had the benefit and the luxury of having a large lab organization, right? So these are people freed of having to ship product ever, and could come up with. And I loved working there, right? We were like the Starship Enterprise. We had a 5-year mission to invent new things that would bring microprocessors to its needs. And it was terrific. But for those of us who don't have that luxury, in my experience, you can't plan for innovation. You can't innovate on demand. What you can do, the best thing you can do is make an environment that's conducive to innovation. I mentioned research spikes a couple of minutes ago. What we did with one of our teams is we took them out of the trenches, actually 2 sprint teams, for 2 weeks. And we said, what if you didn't have to fight fires for a couple of weeks? What kind of cool stuff would you want to work on? Stuff that you would never get around to. And they came up with about 10 really cool things. About half of those are kind of past the sniff test of, wow, is this really worthwhile pursuing? And 3 of them have some of our neighbor groups, really interested in them within the company. So we're going to invest in those 3 things, out of the 5 things that were interesting, out of the 10 things that they came up with. And, we're resourcing it now. Will it ever ship? I don't know, but I know I want to invest in it.
Yeah, I give part of the building on that the same answer that I gave before, which is you can budget for it, so make sure that people have time to innovate. If they're driven on to maximize their velocity and deliver every last story point, they may not have time to innovate. So that's one thing, whether you structure it as 20% time or research spikes or every other Friday or hackathon or whatever. That's one. One way to make sure that you're taking time to innovate. And, then the other thing is just comes down to I think one of the strengths of Agile is the potential, and people don't always implement it this way, to connect your, people that are actually doing the work directly with the customer. So if you're doing, if your teams are really doing demos, they're really, connecting with customers or people that are, closely representing customers, there's a lot better chance of understanding what innovation would really be meaningful, and then you can't guarantee that, but you can certainly raise the odds by providing people the time as well as the ideas and the knowledge of the marketplace.
I think one thing I'll point out in terms of technical innovation specifically is you got to teach the developers to articulate business value. So if they want to completely refactor something or replace a database, they need to be able to talk about, well, why is this good for the business? They can't just expect to get 40 or 80 hours to work on something. They need to explain, well, if you give me these hours to do this refactoring, it means that later on we can have a faster velocity. So it's really important to get the developers themselves talking in that lingo, because it makes it a lot easier to sell it to product owners.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's another way that you can approach it too, and that is to have multiple groups have product owners representing their interests. For example, one company that I was at, we had 3 different groups that were product owners and had allocation for the development team's resources and times. So we had the product management group, which of course was focused almost exclusively on new features, which is why we made this separation, because there wasn't any time for doing the architectural and infrastructure work that was needed in order to be able to generate the new features in the time frame that the product management was looking for. And then also customer requests was the 3rd one. We had a 4th part, which was the unplanned work time, so that we could work on the things that came up unexpectedly. As far as innovation, one of the things that we did at a much smaller company where we had, we started off with 2 teams of 3 developers and 1 QA person, 1 test person. So we didn't have a lab, we didn't have multiple teams that we could allocate. But what we did was we structured our iterations is that there was a half a day in between the retrospective and the planning session for the next one, where people were given that free time to do any kind of research that they wanted to. So it wasn't the 20% that Google did, because we were much too small for that. But what we got out of that was just some pretty amazing stuff, because of course what the developers first focused on was the infrastructure that was needed to help make them more efficient. So what we got out of that was continuous monitoring of the build process, continuous integration of automated tests in the builds, so that when we did the check-ins, which we did multiple times an hour, we got almost immediate feedback about whether or not the build and the test succeeded, so that we could go back and fix things. The other thing that we did at that same very small company was we made sure that everybody on the development team got to go do a customer visit at least once a quarter. This was really essential to getting the developers to understand more about the customers that they were developing things for, and also to bring new ideas into the company from the developer, or from the customers.
Thanks, Dave. I want to add one quick thing. Innovation has many forms. And certainly, having architectural, investments like what you guys have described is really important. But, business process innovation is huge as well. Whether it's internal tooling that you heard from Justin or Dave. We have one of our product owners in the room tonight who's going around, to the four corners of our company and figuring out why is it so painful to migrate, right? To migrate data and system configurations from system A to system B. This is not sexy stuff, but trust me, it doesn't get less sexy than migrating, from system A to system B. But the work that she's doing and the work that will come out of it, I would put up, at the very top end of innovation, because it's going to print money when we get through it. And so you can find innovation in some non-obvious places that are as exciting as the latest cool architecture.
Does anybody have questions so far? Oh,
Yes,
go ahead.
yes. So your last comment I found kind of interesting. Would you include porting to new technologies the same thing? Pertaining to your last comment?
I'm probably the least technologically astute person on the panel, so I'm going to pass that off to someone else first.
I definitely think it's important.
Can we get the question repeated? Some people back here couldn't hear it.
Do you want to repeat it?
Go ahead.
Because you have the mic.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't exactly.
It was, does porting to new technologies fall into that same camp that David was talking about?
Yeah, if someone didn't hear, it's just porting to new technologies fall into the same camp that Dave was mentioning. And I think it definitely does. And I have personal experience with this. I think the amount of technical debt you have can be associated with old technology you're using. And so if you stick with old technology for too long, it's going to take you a lot longer to deliver something simple. And so a lot of times if you weigh out the difference in the development time to support old technology or the time to do porting, it's going to cost you a lot less money to just go to a new technology rather than fighting the old technology that you've been using.
Trade-offs, right?
It's, I agree with that. It's a tough argument to make sometimes.
Yeah, right. It's about business value, though. I mean, I can tell you exactly why it's important to move from CentOS 5 to CentOS 6. And I can tell you in a non-technical way so that I can sell my product owner. I mean, I think it's important to get the product side on board with the technical innovation as well, because they're the guys going up to the executive management and pleading the case for you.
It's so funny you mentioned that, Justin. One of my colleagues and I were up at one of our local universities today, on a recruiting trip. And, we put up the requisite slide of here's all the cool stuff we're looking for, X, Y, Z, a page full of stuff. And, the epiphany was, 3 years ago, none of these things existed. And 3 years from now, none of these things will exist again, right? So the technologies come and go, and, that's the price of admission, that's table stakes. I don't know that I'd actually liken it to innovation, but certainly it's keeping fresh and, doing changes quickly before they eat you alive a few years later.
I'm going to plant a scenario, and this will be open to the panel and anybody out there as to how you dealt with a scenario like this. Let's imagine you're an e-commerce software company. You've got a roadmap, you've got the backlog, you've done all this glorious planning from all the drivers, the marketplace, innovation, technical debt, etc. and you're pulling from the backlog into your iterations. And as an e-commerce company, Amazon comes to you and says, we're completely changing this API that your whole value prop is based on. In the middle of all that work you've done here, how do you respond and reconcile that? What stuff comes off of the backlog or gets pushed down? And how do you go about doing that without upsetting too many apple carts?
Well, that's why your product backlog is prioritized, is that you can cut off the bottom part of it.
There you go. And I think
That's the beauty of Agile, you can do that.
And I think it's a really good point for automation in terms of testing. So if you've properly automated the way that you're doing testing, you can replace that API and have confidence that it's going to work and you know it's going to work, rather than having a month or 3-month or 6-month cycle of manual testing with a lot of risk that it's not going to work at the end of it.
Well, let me add the ramification of that is, we see this all the time, customer change comes in, new requirement comes in, et cetera. I think this is the challenge of weighing the vision and the day-to-day challenge of getting stuff done in Agile. And it comes back to prioritization, but one of the challenges we discussed before this is how do you maintain the vision as the vision gets broken down into epics, user stories, acceptance criteria, et cetera, starts getting nibbled at. And one of the challenges was, well, when is a product good enough and who owns what's good enough? And when you have Amazon came in, they changed the requirements, all of a sudden, the actual released product starts whittling down to this big, where you had a vision of this big. You know, is it good enough? And who decides if it's good enough? That's back to the vision, who owns it from the product owner, product manager, senior management, whatever. But that's the biggest challenge I've seen is maintaining a clear vision. We've all heard of things like minimum viable product. Who owns what is a minimum viable product? And it gets to that. When something new comes in, takes a big chunk of work out, you still got the deliverable, who decides what's good enough? And are you going to delay schedule? Are you going to add resources? Or what are you going to do?
I would add to that another big challenge is how do you have a big mouth, so I need a mic, but in that same scenario, and this usually comes down to the product owner or product manager, and that is you have to be really careful about how much you've exposed what your next release is going to be to stakeholders and any outside world, particularly if there are things in a particular release or iteration that were customer driven by key clients. So when something like this big API shift comes along, and it turns out at the bottom of that backlog is that thing that we really worked hard to get into this particular release falls out. You know, how do you reconcile that? You know, so to me it comes down to how do you as a product owner share or not what depth on your roadmap, what a release may have, time frames and things like that. So I'm curious in that kind of scenario, what kind of problems have you guys experienced that have come up related to that?
So of course, another way to do that is you control how much of the scope is exposed to the customers, and then you have a little bit more flexibility where you can adjust what the actual scope is, what parts of the features are included in that release. So you may not have to cut everything out of there, but you probably have to adjust some of the scope. The other thing too is you can go back to your customers and say, we have this big changes coming along, and we need to look at what is really most important to you. And what I found is that when you have more pressure that comes back on you, and you're talking candidly with your customers, your clients, then you can find that their priorities change. One time we had this list of 24 different features that they wanted. And so what we did is we went back, we did the estimates, we did the plan, we came back to them with a timeline and said, here's your timeline, you need a release at this point, we can do this much of your prioritized list. And they said, oh my goodness, are you kidding? This one down here, number 9, is really, we have to have that. It's like, why was it number 9 instead of number 1? they were trying to do some internal politics, but it wasn't really the most critical thing at the top of their list. When they found out what we were able to do in the time frame they needed, we were able to work with them to figure out what the real priorities were.
I think what's really interesting here is how we would have dealt with it before Agile. So the real difference here is that we're just being honest. I mean, before in the waterfall method, you wouldn't make a date, you kind of just let them know we're working on it, and then their expectation was set so high that you're bound to fail. So now you're just being honest throughout the iterations, and there's really no difference in terms of what you're delivering. It's just the expectation isn't set to a height that really just sets you up for failure.
So Justin, are you saying that maybe Agile as a methodology can help an organization become more transparent to their marketplace?
Exactly. I think you're developing basically the same amount of work. You're just being more transparent, like you said, with your customers.
Just to get real tactical, when presenting a roadmap in an Agile format, I use kind of a 180-60 rule. The first release, the team is guaranteeing, right? So you're 100%. Second release, 80% confident, but here's the priorities, right? And there might be stuff that falls off. Third release, 60%, here's the priorities. The backlog is there, but it's going to be squishy. Stuff comes in, stuff goes out. Just don't expect the third release to be this is what's on the roadmap. So,
I would add to Jeff's comment that, Agile is not just about dev, not even just about product. If you're going to have an Agile organization, you can't just deal with a little kernel inside all those layers and layers of sales and outbound marketing and implementation and all those people who spend 24/7 with the clients. So we struggle with that, at ADP as we go through our transformation, is we can be Agile all day long, and still, the expectation management, is a couple of degrees removed from our product owners. No matter how good we are, no matter how often we try to talk with clients, there's other people in the organization whose job that is. And so our transformation, and perhaps yours, it has to really extend beyond dev, because if you are anything larger than the smallest company, it's easy to say talk to your clients every day, but in practice it's a little harder. You really have to work hard to make that stick. And when you can do it, and we're not doing it really great everywhere, we're doing it really well in a few places now, we have to get it more pervasive, then you can actually, reap some of the benefits that Dave and Justin were talking about in managing expectations, not just in dev.
Yeah. As regards to your original scenario, one thing is you're basically talking about variability. So you've got this big thing from Amazon that's so huge that it's going to take up all your capacity to disrupt your product roadmap. So it isn't non-agile to be proactive or to replace bets. Like I have an example of like a clients that work in a regulated industry where basically what happens is the lawmakers sort of dither over stuff like fiscal cliff or whatever. You don't know what you're going to have to implement, but you know that the deadline's going to be too short to actually implement it, or if it's not too short, it's going to blow out your roadmap for the first quarter because that's all you'll be able to do. So what do you do about that? Well, sometimes you have to, you have to implement a couple of scenarios. You have to look at scenarios to plan ahead. You're paying for that, but part of what you're paying for is that you're then you know that whichever way things go, you're still going to be able to deliver on the promises for the first quarter because you will have the capacity left to do something besides address the fiscal cliff solution, or whatever that thing might be.
Yeah, go ahead.
Of course, with regulated industries, it happens just as often that the regulation implementation gets pushed out because the industry can't meet the deadlines and the lobbyists go to Washington and then the world's change. The other thing that you have to consider is how quickly your customers can assimilate your functionality. So when I was working at online learning management, one of the products that we had was an online learning management system. We could and did put functionality live in production at the end of each 2-week iteration. When I was working in healthcare, our releases were quarterly and semi-annual. So the customer just could not accept more content from us. They had to run through all of their tests and their approval boards before they can put anything live. So we have to pace our releases according to what our customers put us in with. So,
No, I'm sorry. You got a question, Doctor?
So my question is about some different ways that you've seen organizations deal with accountability throughout this chain of development, and not as a way of placing blame, but as a tool for improving process. So the tendency that I've seen is for product management or business to blame the development team for inaccurate estimates and not accounting for all this unaccounted work. And the developers blame business analysis for not clearly specifying what was happening. So I'm just curious, not for the right answer, but just about some of the different ways that you've seen organizations deal with that issue.
I'm going to start by passing on. From my experience, if you built your product management, product ownership team correctly, the product manager, whoever runs your product management processes, is the accountable person. That doesn't mean that he operates in a vacuum, he or she operates in a vacuum. For example, the final decision, should something hit the roadmap, you're going to need a leader from the dev team, you're going to need somebody from the executive team, and the product manager. You can't make those decisions in a vacuum, but ultimately, he's working both those sides that you talked about. He or she is doing the runaround of all the different stakeholders, the sales, CS, whoever, and with the development team, he's empowering them. Without getting into the details of product management here tonight, that means everything from properly writing requirements and user stories. When I say proper, I mean, hey, add a report that's purple. No, add a report that comes out Tuesdays at 3:15 a.m. that's in a PDF that goes to these 3 people. Does the user story say that, or add a report that's purple? My point being, the product manager has to wear many hats, walking both sides of those things. I know that's hard. That's kind of the beauty of being in product management. You have to wear a lot of shticks and hats to make that happen. But that person ultimately acts like a mini CEO without the P&L accountability, and they are the accountable person. So, other thoughts?
Yeah, so this is kind of simple, but it's something we've done to illustrate your point, which is we have a release planning meeting, and we invite our business partner. And what we do is we print out all of the news stories that we're hoping to get into the release, but we also print out in a different color all of the stories that came out that weren't included in the previous release planning meeting, and put those on the wall and just say, look at this wall. I mean, half the wall wasn't part of release planning. This is why we didn't make the date, because we're working on all this other stuff.
Quick question, do you have a mature Agile team or fairly new to Agile team?
Mature Agile team.
I'm sorry?
We've been doing it for a while.
A mature. Because usually what you see is that over time, you get maturity, there's more mutual respect, the learning goes up, you start, grooming becomes more sophisticated, you plan more in advance of grooming, so that problem usually never goes away, but starts going down a little bit, so I'm just curious. But that's the challenge of the grooming, and one of the rules of thumb that I like to work with any team is design work and other types of fast prototyping has to be at least one whole sprint ahead of any grooming and effort, or ideally 2 or more sprints. Because of that problem, you can't go into a sprint assuming you know what the design is going to be. So I think if there's any pre-homework that kind of can shrink and improve the estimates based on pre-work and pre-estimation, and the collaboration between product management and product ownership on what are you talking about, this feature function or user story, it starts closing the gap, but it usually improves over time. So just curious.
It's a great question. So in the spirit of the way you asked it, I'll tell you kind of what we found works and what doesn't work. What didn't work for years was throwing your so-called colleague under the bus, right? Which was the dev guy saying the product owner, didn't have a clue, and the converse of that. We took a solemn pact. It was a blood oath when we started this transformation that we were all in this thing together. Number one, no more throwing your so-called colleague under the bus. Number two, the new unit of productivity and capacity is the sprint team. It's not half of Julian or Dorian, pardon me, and 3/4 of Dave or half a QA guy. The sprint team, right, is the unit of capacity. Number three, you're talking about governance. And I spend probably 3 days out of every week managing expectations for our executive staff. Now, we do it informally, ad hoc, and continuously, but once a month, we have a sit down, and it's lightweight. It's a lot lighter weight than it used to be. But the governance is providing the appropriate level of oversight without having all the executives in our sprint team shorts so we never get too far divergent. So it's a great question.
Yeah, I agree with what Dorian said, that generally, if people are working well, the product owner team will have mutual respect. There will be very little distance between them. They will, so they will not throw each other under the bus. So then, if you don't have that problem, then there's probably some meeting of managers somewhere where, product owners come in and basically are afraid to tell the truth, and that's where people get thrown under the bus. So the thing to do is find out where the bus is occurring and put a stop to that.
Talk about governance. And earlier I used the word transparency. The product owner or product manager, his job is to be the transparency hub between all the facets of the organization, right? So you mentioned once a month with the executive team. In addition to that, you might want to consider let's say you're doing 2-week iterations. Why not have a meeting every 2 weeks or so with key representatives from customer support, key representatives from sales, so that they're helping drive in an agile fashion the requirements, the hot things that are happening aside from or in addition to the planned roadmap. And then the next meeting 2 weeks from now, you go back to them and say, here's what we did on what you told us 2 weeks ago. What's your next thing for these 2 weeks? So they're getting transparency back from the dev team where they're at on a more micro scale. And then vice versa, the transparency goes back this way. And when you break it up into that kind of frequency, if you do get thrown under the bus, it's a little tiny little bus, not this big gnarly thing. So it's about transparency and acting as that hub both ways. You talked about honesty, but it's really transparency. If you're transparent, throw me under the bus.
So it's also about learning. You said that you had a fairly mature, agile team. I've done similar things to what Justin was talking about, where you put different color-coded pieces up. So like things that came in that were unplanned went up on the board as red. And then we addressed those when we did the retrospectives, figure out what was going on. And if it was a recurring problem, happened 2 or 3 sprints, then we do some root cause analysis of it and figure out what we need to do to change. So it's how we learned from those problems and avoided them. We also had, for bigger things that were really beyond the scope or capacity of the sprint team to deal with, we had a change control board that was comprised of the executives, and the product owner and the dev owner and program manager all went and talked to the executives and explained to them what the issue was, what the risks were, what the business cost estimates were, and got buy-in from them to either implement changes or cut scope, whatever they decided that they needed to do in order to meet the business goals. And we did do some of that stuff that you were talking about with the customer support. They had feedback into our iterations so that we could solve the most pressing problems that the customers were beating them up about. And they really agreed to love us because we took care of the problems with just a small part of the resources of the team.
I'd like to actually ask, I want this to be more interactive and not so much us lecturing, because we're all experts in the field, I'm hoping. That exact scenario, the accountability or the governance or the transparency, how have some of you addressed that in your organization? Maybe I'll just start walking around with the microphone like Phil Donahue.
So I just want to kind of go off what Dorian said, because I think it's based on what everybody was talking about, not to discount what everybody else was saying, I think was the most important one. And that is, as a product manager, you do own what the problem is, what the problem is getting solved. And what I've found when it comes down to dev either coming back and saying, product didn't know it well enough, or product saying, oh, it was underestimated, is that if you spend the time doing the discovery up front, and you are working that 2, 3, however many sprints ahead you need to be working, that's our job as product managers, to be understanding the problem, doing the discovery, and you have a lead dev, hopefully you have UX on your team, and you have a product manager, and that's what you're doing. You're actually discovering the problem, you're prototyping rapidly, and if you have a prototype and you understand the problem, and dev's coming back and saying that they can't give you an estimate, then you have bigger problems, I think, to worry about.
Can you throw dev under the bus?
Then you throw dev under the bus.
You did your job.
Anybody else have something to add? If we had more mics, I apologize. Throwing me under the bus.
I successfully led a number of Agile projects at HP, at Hewlett Packard, since the year 2000. We started doing that for our open source Linux drivers, which were industry-changing drivers, and we were releasing those once a month to the end customers. This issue around what happens if you get a story that's not executable, the process we always used in Agile processing around that was that, as the gentleman said, the product owner owned making sure that the stories were ready to execute. And to avoid throwing anybody under the bus, what we would do from the dev team is that we would actually set a rule that we can't let any stories go into sprint planning unless they're executable at that point. There's enough detail to be executable. But the team, the whole team, including the dev team and the product owner, own that problem. They own the problem of working together to make sure that those stories are executable. And if and there's a feedback loop between the dev team and the product owner saying, no, it's not ready. You've got to do more work on this. There's a way to do it. And one of maybe those some important ahas for people that are new to the Agile process is that the product owner role is a hell of a lot of work. Yes. It is a lot of work. It's a very busy work, and it's a critical work. And the process won't work without it. And it's not something someone can do part-time. It's a huge job. And so that was our perspective. I have one more question, if I could ask, which is, you kind of touched on this already. The Agile processes specify pretty clearly creating a product backlog and prioritizing that and having stories on that. But one of the most difficult things for product owners is that the Agile processes really don't define how you do that. And you kind of touched on some best practices, but I'd like to ask the panel on what the best practices are, because the Agile process requires some magic to happen to get a prioritized product list that's well defined. And what are the best practices for creating that list?
Take this mic up to you guys. We're going to talk about the hard work in product management. Before I got into product management, I was 6'5".
I think there's a lot of emerging tools that haven't become standard. User stories are standard. One tool that I think a lot of people benefit from looking at is story maps. So you talk about roadmaps, but Jeff Patton has this concept of story maps, which basically you lay out the backbone of your process, and then you elaborate it downward so you can envision the different layers that you're going to implement incrementally, and everybody can envision how that plays. So I think that's one good tool that a lot of places can benefit from trying out, even if you don't end up adopting it. I think it changes the game.
So my preamble is that I had no financial interest in pragmatic marketing, but I drank the pragmatic marketing Kool-Aid years ago, long before we went Agile. And the pragmatic, the 1-minute version of it is that you have to come up with a rating system, and it can be completely arbitrary as long as it's consistently applied in your organization for measuring 2 things. How urgent is a problem on a scale from 1 to 3 or 1 to 10, and how pervasive is it, right? How many customers are having the same problem, right? Because what we're solving for are common needs, right? That aren't just really important to one customer, but are important enough to lots of customers. So you could add a 3rd column, right? But this becomes a very simple, rote, formulaic thing to do a spreadsheet, right? To help prioritize your backlog, as the case may be. The 3rd column might say, how big a task is it, right? Not super detailed estimation, but from somebody, a senior enough dev person to say, Is it really big, really small, or somewhere in between? And that's a really brute force, but highly repeatable, reliable way to prioritize things that I found is very, very helpful.
Those are all good. Prioritization is critical. I just want to throw out an example of a user story. I think user story, vision to user story is a big challenge. There are, I don't know if best practice is the right word. It's you work at it until everybody understands it. If you're Google's kind of one user story. As a user, I want to enter search terms and get back great results. That's a user story, and that's the entire service of Google. I could make that one user story, send it to the dev team and say, go figure it out. Or I can make that 600,000 user stories of all the little nuances of Google and what it does for you. It really has to be product management working through what am I really trying to do for customers, thinking about it in terms of customer problems and what they're trying to accomplish, working with product owners, developing this vision in terms of whatever the number of, I call them vision stories at that top level, and they have to get broken down. So doing in terms of user stories is great. It puts us a customer perspective on, but you can get lost in the weeds of all the nuance of what a customer's trying to do. How do you bring that back up? So what's the real value and the dimensions that you're really trying to create a value for the customer? And that's the half art and half science. User story is a mechanism, but there's some art to writing them so everybody gets it and shares that vision.
I think for the team I work on, there's two key points. One is that you really need to have a trusted relationship with a technical resource if you're a product owner, so that you have someone to walk through these stories with and get the sort of ballpark, how difficult is this. The other thing that the other approach that we've taken is, if it doesn't matter to you as a product owner, it shouldn't be in the story. And when we first started Agile, we had these stories that were like, 8 pages long, and it went through all these details and ended up being a specification document. And it ended up that if you talked about what the product owner really wanted to do, it was in the first sentence. And so you really got to have that trust with at least one person on the technical side, and then with your team that they're going to get you to the goal you need within that story, and they'll deal with the rest of the technical details behind it.
Justin, I would add to that there's going to be many times when, in addition to the technical lead, you want to bring the architect in. Not only big, small, medium, but is it even feasible?
Right.
So,
or even for suggestions. So, okay, I know you want to do it that way, but what about this approach? In my experience on using the internet or in terms of technology, maybe I have a different view on it that could streamline the process or make it a little bit better.
So one thing that we use pretty frequently in one company I was at was customer focus groups. And what we would do is we would show them the incremental features that we were developing, get feedback from them for what their current needs were. And if we have specific questions about, we don't really know what's more important to our customer base about this feature or that feature, we could take it to them and figure that out. Another piece of the prioritization is what level are you prioritizing at? So is this a portfolio kind of prioritization which has a totally separate thing? So for example, we had one place that I was working had specialty user interfaces for different market groups that overlay the common functionality. And so within that program, we had prioritizations about which were the most important market segments to address first. And so we've got that prioritization, but sometimes that changed also depending upon what was happening in the marketplace. And then we would then do the same. We take the same set of features. So once we figured out that this is the user interface, especially that we wanted to focus on, we would then prioritize the major features in that and go back to the customers and say, we know that these 3 things are most important to you, but what about numbers 4, 5, and 6? What do you want? And so we would adjust the releases based on those priorities that we were getting from the customers.
A quick best practice, I don't know, best practice or common practice, but one of the challenges of user stories, I think, is when you start dividing up user stories, you start losing the big picture forest for the trees issue. One good practice, I think, is using epics, prioritizing epics separate from user stories, so that if you know you want a whole feature, a whole experience, you might be getting rid of some user stories. It might not seem like they have a higher priority, but taking other user stories in an epic that have lower priority, but you're getting a whole epic, or you're getting a whole experience for the customer. You might be getting rid of one big chunk of functionality, but you've created complete functionality in another area. And most customers would argue that's a better experience than giving you a little bit of everything. So that's back to leadership.
And that's what we were doing. We were prioritizing the epics based on the feedback that we got from the customers.
I would add to that, maybe even a third level, something that I've put into practice in several companies, and I call it forests, groves, and trees, instead of epics and stories. Forests are the epics, the big macro things that tie into strategic corporate directives. How do you break those down into groves, sets of functionalities and features related to that directive? And the trees within a grove are those stories within there. So yeah, go ahead.
I agree that there's lots of different ways, whether it's a 3-point or 5-point or 10-point scale, how many columns you have. I've done multi-million-dollar projects for big banks, and I've done tiny projects for startups, individual features, and that doesn't seem to be really where the difference is. One of the big differences is on the governance, as you guys were talking about, transparency of the process, ownership, and the communication. I think that's what I would put at the top of the list for best practices. And along with that, to the extent possible, to make sure that those groups are collaborating. I had several great experiences with my startup where we really had to put our heads together to solve that technical debt. And as we did this, and I wanted to tie this onto an earlier conversation about technical debt and also innovation. And I don't know if it can be done in organizations of all sizes, but it really worked well in our startup, which had like 12 people, that we would get together once a month and look at the entire backlog, no matter what its priority, no matter which epic it was, no matter which user story, and we would all put our heads together, and oftentimes we would be able to pick out individual features or tasks, some bugs, some enhancements, some whatever they were, and say, you know what, we could solve all those if we changed our technology, changed our platform, upgraded to the next level of SQL, or rethought the business process and took that back to our client base and said, hey, you don't need these 5 things that you've been holding on to that are sacred cows. We can replace all of this with a new document management system in our case, or whatever it was. And so I think that one of the things I didn't hear explicitly, but where we found the innovation came was really by looking at that quote-unquote prioritized list, deprioritizing it for a moment, in one session a month, and it usually was a half a day to a day. We go through everything and say, well, what patterns do we see and how can we get through it? The question I have for the panel or anybody else has to go back to resources, which was one of the first topics that we covered. And as a manager, as a product owner, and as an entrepreneur, I've found to be the toughest. What have you found in terms of dedicating resources to solving the technical debt, i.e. fixing bugs? Is it good to have just a team, hey, you're the bug fixers, that's what you guys do, and this other team, you're working on the new cool features? Do you cross, say everybody gets a little bit of both, or do you say this month is bug fixes? I'd be interested to know what others are doing, including the panel.
So we face the same issue, whether or not to have specific Scrum teams dedicated to defect fixes or to intermix it. What we ended up doing is intermixing it. The reason was domain expertise. So if we had one, and responsibility. So if you had one team that all they did was defect fixes, they're fixing the quality issues that was introduced by the other Scrum team. That's really not fair. And it also means that they know they're not ultimately responsible for it. So when they know that they're going to be pulled off of the fun stuff to work on fixing the defect they introduced, there's a lot more motivation to make sure those defects aren't introduced in the first place.
So that depends on the industry, right?
Sure.
So, for example, with healthcare and regulated industries, you have mandated functionality that you have to implement. You have to have teams dedicated to that in order to make that happen. it's a larger organization, and we did have separate teams to do the sustaining engineering. And part of that was, it wasn't that the existing teams were introducing new bugs, which they were, so much as it was 15-year-old technology that had large technical debt that had to be addressed because of customer pressure and just making sure that the product would actually work for the customer instead of them being down. We've also done with smaller teams where it's been mixed, and for exactly those same kinds of reasons.
I'll point out one other thing. I work specifically in credit compliance, so we are completely driven by federal, state, and even county regulations. So this stuff comes up all the time. The point I'm making, though, is just that to put it all on one team isn't really, from a developer's perspective, there's no incentive in doing that as a full-time job. That would be, in my personal opinion, a horrible job to do, honestly.
Some people like it.
I'm just speaking from a product management perspective. The management side, the pool of resources always scared me. That's engineering and development says I got 300 developers. They're all going to work on different things at any moment. It scared me personally because then I don't know exactly who's working on what at any moment. So by just putting them in tracks and say, okay, we got 4 tracks, and tying it to Epic and Vision and what everybody's working on, I felt more comfortable. That said, there's certain people working on certain big problems, and there's other teams working on other big problems. It makes me feel more comfortable. I don't know if it's best practices or not, but the pool of engineering always, I think, gives management a little bit of a scare. Anybody have that experience? Anybody agree with me? Nobody agree with me. Yeah. Nobody agrees with me?
One thing I've seen at my prior employer, not my current employer, is that you're right, Justin, fixing bugs sucks, right? Because it's punitive, it's sometimes someone else's work. And the only place I've seen this work, again, at a prior employer, was if you could make that a badge of honor. You know, when you become a doctor and you're doing your residency, you have to go through the ER. You have to go through all kinds of places, no matter what your final destination will be. And if you can create an elite team that's not a standing team forever, that rotates people in and out, you could turn, you know, fixing bugs into a cool place where I get the badge. I did that. I was in the trenches. Then, you know, you get to have better developers. This is a big investment, by the way, because you're going to have to tell this story to people who aren't going to want to do it. But I've seen it work, not with a standing team forever, but with people rotating through, and they become better developers because they see the crap that someone before them left, and it really can inspire them to, when they go back to their other day job, to become a better developer.
David, I'll go one step further on the rotating through. I've seen this work really well, and that is take a developer and set them down in customer service for some period of time, 2 weeks. And they're in the trenches with customer service, working on those things. And then you rotate your team through there. Within reason, there's some people you wouldn't want to pull off to put down there, but you rotate people and you have them sit right in the weeds of customer. Sorry if that's offensive to customer support people, but where the action is that relates to the stuff that he said sucks, bug fixes. And that also helps with the transparency I'm talking about. You're creating a link between the dev team and customer support or customer service now knows that you are listening to them. Boy, they just sent one of their guys or gals down to our department for a month. So
I guess I just want to say I agree with Justin and kind of point out, like from Dorian's comment, that what you have to recognize is that if you're doing something because it's a limitation of your ability to manage resources, then that's why you're doing it. You're not doing it because it's the best way to, prevent defects. So, the good thing to think about is how can you find a more effective way to manage resources. And all of these things that have been mentioned, there are people, the answer is it depends, and people cycle through all of them, but I think at the heart of it, Justin is correct, that the best way to prevent defects is, if I'm going to get a big award for launching a product, and then I'm going to go to Mexico, somebody else is going to get called in the middle of the night to fix all the mistakes I made. That's fundamentally not a very healthy dynamic for the organization. if I'm gonna get called in the middle of the night, fix the defects that I made, then I'm not gonna think, I'm gonna think about to make those defects.
One brand new tool I'll point out, which my team uses, is something called BuildCoin. So basically, it is a gamification system for doing proper integration, unit tests, and functional tests. And so it's a game. You basically earn points for fixing a broken unit test or integration test. And they compete, and I see it every day. Our developers, they want to be the top guy on the scoreboard, so they'll go in and just start writing more unit tests or fix broken tests. So I think that's another method that you can employ.
Is that a software that you buy, or you invented this?
No, it's a service that hooks into version control systems and continuous integration systems like Jenkins and Git, that sort of thing.
What was the name of that? Could you explain that a little more?
Sure, it's called BuildCoin, and it's basically a gamification system for continuous integration. So when you make a commit on your version control system, be it Git or Subversion, whatever, it sends the fact that you made a commit, and then Jenkins also communicates with BuildCoin to let it know the result of the build, whether or not it passed or there are any issues. And then if some unit test or functional test is broken, it sends an email to the entire team and says, this functional test is broken, we'll give you 5 build coins if you fix it, whoever fixes it first. And they all race to fix it because they want to get the build coins to be the top person on the leaderboard. I believe it's buildcoin.com.
Isn't that disruptive to the normal production productivity?
It really isn't, because as part of the definition of done, all of your unit tests have to pass. So in reality, they should be doing this anyway. It just has them sort of fight for who's going to do it rather than fight over who has to do it.
Yeah, so we did our own manual way of indicating that, but the people who made the mistake and introduced a bug had to go back and fix it. So I can't imagine having the whole team going off to try to fix one bug.
Right, well, they have it built in the system where you take ownership of it and fix it. So you got to go on and say, I'm going to go on and attempt to fix the bug. You have a period of time that it's attached to you.
I think we have a burning comment or question from Max back there.
Yeah, from a planning perspective, how do you go about fixing an organization where the business doesn't quite get the Agile process and they're expecting more of a waterfall delivery, but the rest of the dev team is really moving ahead with this methodology?
So this the whole topic of if your dev team is Agile and your organization isn't, how do you reverse that engine?
We all have stories there. I think that's a very common occurrence, and I think a lot of product managers still write requirements documents, MRDs and PRDs or PRQs, whatever you write, and then they get translated into user stories, epics, and et cetera. So I think there's still this transition going on. I think from management perspective, I've never seen management that doesn't want some sort of light documentation that says, what are you guys building? Give me the product sheet, give me something, give me the design. So I still think there's that requirement on product management and product owners to create enough of a documentation of what are we building over what time frame and share that. And then when it comes to sharing the roadmap, you still have to convert features, functions, and user experiences into what the actual dev team is building, user stories and epics. So that's a challenge, but somebody's got to translate it. When you're at the board level or at the GM level and you're presenting the roadmap, you still have to translate user stories into what am I getting as a product in terms of a salesperson or a management would understand.
I guess to answer Max's question, my answer would be you do it by degrees and you do it incrementally, and it's really hard work. But the fundamental nucleus of that is really that same thing that everybody experiences, which we talked about before, when the product owner starts to trust the team and say oh, I don't need that. I trust you. We had a conversation and that's enough. I know you'll do it. So it's just fundamentally a matter of amplifying that cycle, and you run into all kinds of problems because in most organizations, to amplify that to the executive level would take years, and there's enough turnover among executive managers that by the time, somebody starts to get it, they're in a different role, or they're no longer there, or somebody else is their boss. But you really just have to keep amplifying that cycle, and eventually, the parts of that are easier to, basically it gets easier. People start to learn the basics, and you can go on to more advanced versions of it, and just sort of keep consolidating from there.
Max, it's a great question. Here's what we're doing kind of in real time at ADP. And this experiment is not done yet, but we did a couple of things. First off, we dismantled two separate organizations. We had a big R&D organization, and then we had a big product organization. And we'd always do this awkward dance, right? And that was role modeled up through our executive staff. But we had a senior vice president of dev, and then a senior vice president of product. No longer. There's one guy now. He's responsible for products and technology. So we got rid of the fence, right? We all have the same reward system, the same incentives, IMBOs, whatever you want to call them. Below that, in each pocket, we have a product person and a dev person who are married, right? So whatever unit of the organization that we're talking about, they're in this thing together. But your original question of how do you recruit that executive champion or whatever, it's really important, independent of Agile or any other topic. You have to find that person. In our case, we're blessed to have a really good guy now, again, who's responsible for product and dev. And again, the governance thing, right? We get with them, with the rest of our executive staff, frequently enough, which in our case is about monthly. We don't go through all the gruesome detail, but we go through kind of a quarterly roadmap of themes or epics. He wants to know, what am I getting for my $150 million a year, right? I'm expecting stuff to come out here this fiscal year. So they get enough high-level stuff. I'm getting to roughly the stuff in Q1, Q2 through Q4, and that gives them the confidence they need for the trust, to get their hands out of our underwear and let us do what we need to do. And so it's really a variety of those things. It's still an experiment. So far, it's working.
I would add on the governance and the transparency stuff that I've been talking about. I mentioned before, run every 2 weeks, for example, a meeting with key people from support, and a different one, key people from sales. Then monthly or quarterly, you do the same thing with the executive staff. It does two things. It creates transparency back to them. Here's what we're building, here's where we're at on it, against what you wanted and what you thought, and vice versa. Our next iteration is going to look like this. Anybody got a problem with it? Without, I'm not going to open up a big, crazy session, but that the transparency of holding these regular meetings where information flows both ways, less frequently on the executive level, but frequently enough till they feel they're tied into it, more frequently on the individual stakeholders or drivers of the roadmap level. And in doing that, and being this transparency agent going both ways, you kind of build them into an agile rhythm. Who else has some thoughts on that, or some experiences from your own work in addressing that exact scenario? Okay. Any more comments from the panel on that then? And then when he's done, I want somebody out there to try to stump this panel. Come up with something related to our topic du jour and really hammer.
I was just going to say, with respect to governance, it's really important to have a sense of shared fate so that people that are making a decision, they understand that if they get more, some other member of their peers is going to get less.
So tough questions related to this subject matter. It's tough, I better give you.
We'll take an easy question, by the way. An easy question is just fine.
So this might be a little squishy, but I guess my question is, are there any specific techniques, or how do you guard against planning too much, or knowing when you need to stop planning and start executing? There's a lean startup idea of a product that's just a hypothesis until it's validated by the market. How do you drive towards just plan enough so we can get going and get market validation before we continue?
So the standard answer to that is time boxing. You have, your planning lasts for, if you've got a 2-week iteration, your planning lasts a half day. and you focus on the highest priority things, drill down into the detail for that, go back out and get your estimates, but the whole thing is time box. It's iterative within that time box to get more information, so that the dev team feels that they have enough information to estimate, and to implement. And you go back and you reprioritize, because after you do the task level estimating, you can get different priorities from the product owner if they see something's going to cost them more and something that they really want is going to drop out. It's the same thing I was talking about earlier with customers, right? Once the line has been drawn, then you find out what your real priorities are. But in order to keep from do too much planning, it's the time box. It's the whole concept around Agile.
Let's see. So Agile 1 is designed to fix that problem. I think there are a couple issues. One is the big challenge I see Agile teams want to do is the customer feedback loop, the customer insight loop. And I forget what it is. First Agile tenet or the third one that says we will be customer driven. Anybody know?
I think it's the second or third one. Third. I don't think it's the first one.
All right, let's call it third. But and the irony is that a lot of companies, teams don't have any mechanism for bringing customers consistently through. And I think Agile didn't start out as open market products or software. They started out as more, I can debate this, they started out more where customers are readily available as customer-focused software versus market-focused software, and there's a big difference. So I think to get to the point of what's an MVP and how do we decide it, one is obviously product leadership has to be extremely close to the market and understand, well, what are we trying to accomplish, what's the minimum, and then it's to close the loop with customers to go, it's good enough. So a quick case study, I was working with a company which remain nameless in Seattle, and they had internal debates of this new cloud-based media entertainment software, and the development team said it's good enough, ship it, it's good enough, ship it. Product management says it's not good enough, ship it, it's not good enough, ship it. The CEO said, I don't know who to believe. So lucky me, get to come in. What's the first thing I did? I said, let's ask some customers. They already had beta customers, so we literally invited in a couple of groups of 12 beta customers and created a closed loop. And when the customer said it was ready to ship, it was ready to ship. But we didn't know that until we had that closed loop. So it takes a vision, takes an understanding of the minimum viable product, and it takes customers to validate that. So it's a long answer.
In my own experience, I haven't been in too many environments where we did too much planning. Usually these sins we commit are sins of omission, not too much planning. But there's three dimensions of planning, right? There's the product planning, the macro level view. What are we looking over the next year? Maybe chunked down by quarters. Of course, there's the sprint planning, and then there's the release planning, right? So if you do a reasonably good job at your hygiene around those three things, the MVP, the definition of an MVP may change. You may decide that, yeah, you could ship that product after every sprint, but as a practical matter, as Dave said, your clients can't consume it that quickly, so your release cadence may be very different, and in practice will be different than your development cadence. So I would just say make sure you have the right rhythm and the right cadence for those three dimensions of planning, and that way you'll be able to adapt very quickly to what the MVP means this month.
I'll just read my answer from earlier. I mean, you can, kind of what Dave says, you can budget your planning and not overspend time on that. The other thing is that you should be able to get better at it. So I don't think a lot of organizations over-plan in the sense that the plans they produce are too many or too much. They spend a lot of time trying to plan, and they don't get better at it. So, as you get better at it, you can apply kind of a Kaizen approach where, like, if you've got a Scrum team that started out and it took them a day to plan a 2-week sprint, you hope that by 15 months into it, they could do that in 4 hours or something like that. And they would be able to do that. Science would see at that level would be, they would get better at backlog, and they would be more efficient at having dialogues. They wouldn't use the whole team when they didn't need the whole team to call on the right customers, and they know, when to trust themselves and who to trust. And so you can try to basically start with an amount of planning and plan to spend less time doing that.
Can I quote Eisenhower? Plans are nothing, planning is everything. So as soon as you figure out your hypothesis, your MVP is just a hypothesis, then you're done, and then you go through the iterations. It's the beauty of Agile, is you don't have to have it buttoned up like an MRV. You just create a hypothesis and you get started, and then you learn and iterate until customers say, that's good. Well, in your case, if it's a market, your vision is achieved, what you think is going to hit the market targets. But the goal used to be what? Planning in a waterfall would take 6 months. Planning in Agile should take maybe 6 weeks at the most. You can probably get it done in 2 or 3 weeks.
I would add that part of the construct of Agile is kind of continuous planning.
Yeah.
So based on what you said, rather in the waterfall method, it's maybe 6 months of pretty heavy lifting. In an Agile environment, the product ownership team is constantly planning, but light lifting. So the combination of finger on the pulse of the marketplace and unplanned versus planned, these kinds of things mixing in, and how you pull from the backlog to create your iterations. It's kind of an ongoing process. And I'm going to kind of take a tangent a little bit on, we talked about the marketplace versus the customer. One of the things that's really, I've found when I work with companies, it's really important to help them differentiate is, what is the marketplace? It's not just customers, it's prospective customers, it's solution partners that you may integrate with, it's media analysts, it's anybody who has an influence on what you're doing or not. So the product management, product ownership team really has to have their finger on the pulse of all of those things, and that is an ongoing process. If the market was static, it wouldn't be, but the markets are dynamic, and that creates the need for agile planning, which is, in my opinion, continuous planning. Does that make sense to you guys? On this topic of planning, how to plan, the burden of planning, who else has a unique scenario they'd like to share?
I think that one of the main things that with planning is that a lot of times people bring in too many people to try to plan, or kind of a saying that one of the worst things you can do is listen to your customers, and one of the worst things you can do is not listen to your customers, right? So you need to get out in front of your market, you need to understand the problem, but you need to learn how to say no to people. And I think that if you're saying yes all the time, then that plan goes from 10 things to 50 things, whether that's no to your salespeople, whether that's no to your support people, whether that's no to your customers. So just start saying we're not going to do these things, and those things are low priority. Don't bullshit anybody and pretend like you're ever going to do them, because you're not. And start pulling them off the list.
Exactly.
Back to the backlog.
Yeah, talk about listening to the customer, not listening to the customer. A lot of times the customer may not really know what they want. They'll say, I need this. But when you really dig down into it and do some discovery, what they said they need versus what their business really needs is two different things. So,
Thank you for making that point about saying no. One of the things we learned on early writing, stories and problems and personas was, don't you tell me what you want, but tell me why. What bad thing happens if you don't get that? Is it a public safety issue? Will I lose revenue? Will I be exposed to criminal prosecution? Thank you. So really important to get to the why. And a good product manager versus a mediocre product manager will be able to tease that out, tease out what the latent needs are. And we had customers for years who would say, I want this button in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And we would faithfully give them that button in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And we weren't doing them or us any favors by giving them what they asked for, because we never went to the next level and said why, and what are you really trying to accomplish versus where you want the button on the screen. So teasing out the latent need is really, really huge.
which, sorry, I may be talking too much, I'm holding the water here. We talk about the why, and you think about product planning, product management, really they should be focused on the what and the why. Dev is the how. And a lot of times that why gets missed, and that's a great point. Another scenario or another question related to, yeah, bear with me.
The gentleman from Hewlett Packard reminded us what a challenging job product management and product ownership is. So I have a two-part question. First, from a developer's perspective, what are the areas of greatest frustration with a product owner or product manager? Where aren't they delivering? And then B, if you could analyze that and come up with some root causes of why that frustration occurs.
How much time do we have? Justin.
Can we reverse that also, frustration?
One at a time.
So one of the really frustrating things that my teams have experienced is with the product owner not being available to answer questions. And so then they have to figure out the what and the why, and they don't have the insight into the market or the insight into the customers. So that's a significant area of frustration. And what I found is that the product owners are often doing a lot of different things. So they don't have enough time to allocate to the team to always be available when the team's there, but they don't have enough time to completely groom the backlog as much as they would like to, because their management is giving them other tasks, other goals that they have to satisfy. So I tried working with the product management to get them to understand that. Some get it and some don't. So sometimes they've been able to make changes, allocate more time for the product owners to spend more time with the dev teams, and sometimes they don't, because they have different business drivers.
So I think the biggest frustration I had in the very beginning was product owners describing kind of to the button point, saying, I need this new button or this new feature, rather than explaining the business value and need. And so in the beginning it made it pretty difficult, because you're not allowing your development team to come up with the solution. You've already kind of skipped that step. So I think that's kind of the biggest frustration. I would agree with you too that I mean, product owner is such a thankless job, and they're required to be.
It's an awesome job.
It's a horrible job.
From spoken as a true developer, it's
right. I mean, I say it's a horrible job because you have to be everywhere at all times. You got to be there to answer the questions from the development team. You got to talk to the executives. Especially in my situation, I've got half my team in the U.S., half in India. That means the product owner has to be available for the India team, which has a 12.5-hour time difference. So, you know, that's a frustration, but I totally get it. It's such a difficult job to do and to do well.
I guess I agree with what's been said, so maybe I'll just go, what I think the why is. I think a lot of times, especially in large organizations, the idea of the product owner from Scrum, really where that term came from, is like it's a single wringable neck. But it gets to the question of like, well, what do you want from accountability? Do you want to wring people's neck, or do you want to get results? And I think a lot of organizations, you see a case where you can identify like everybody's ideal product owner, but you never have enough of them. So you have like this one person going, if everybody could be like her, then it'd be perfect. But if you get a situation where you're like the plurality of product owners are deficient or failing, you have to really look at the system that they're operating in. I think there's a lot of causes. One cause is just sort of too much distance, where you have like a product marketing person who's both client-facing and is supposed to be with the team. That's like a no-win situation for a product owner. You can't be in two places at once. And in a lot of cases, where you have a really complex domain, you end up in a situation where, product owner, you'd have to be, a product owner, an architect, and user experience person all in one to really be a product owner, and you can't. So in some situations, people try to build sort of product owner teams where they have sort of cross-disciplinary teams, rather than just saying like everybody has to be the perfect product owner. They start to create shared accountability basically to bridge all those areas that the product owner has and try to be more, try to get a higher success rate.
Can I ask the audience a question? How many people think that the product owner and the product manager should be the same person? How many people think it's, okay, how many people think it's clearly two different roles? How many aren't sure? Wow, third. This is part of the core, I think, challenge and confusion of companies that work as a structure. If you want to go into that at all.
Yeah, I mean, that and I deal a lot, almost every day with clients. Where does product management reside?
Where's project management?
The dev, marketing on its own. But actually, before we get onto that, you had a question earlier, and I kind of blew it and didn't give you the mic, so if you still have a question.
I have a question, I guess, that applies a little also to that question as to where do you find your product managers or product owners, especially in an IT organization that simply supports the company versus has an actual product out there on the market. And with those kind of organizations, how do you handle that as a product manager when you have your products smeared across who knows how many agile teams that have their own different backlogs, of which many of them are shared service teams who have now multiple product managers to manage. So how does everybody stay sane without looking at bottom of the bottle?
I mean, I think in internal IT, you know, the best product managers are, the best product owners are people that have been close to the domain and have worked, you know, seen different levels of it. So the pattern that I've seen be effective is people who are maybe, you know, frontline managers recently promoted from their role, or looking at it as a rotation, like if you're trying to sort of go from that frontline management to the next line of management, one thing you can do to get more breadth of experience is to serve a rotation of product owner. But you know, once people sort of professionalize that role, that can work too, but often they become more distant from the work that they need to do in the business, and the business processes change, and they don't have the same perspective on what they've done. So that's from an IT situation. That's one way I like to try to structure it, is to have that, to have it be, you know, a 6-month or a 12-month rotation, and then people move on to something else. You have to have a way, I'd say, to replenish that pipeline. But the good thing is you're building understanding in the process, because those people go on to other roles, and they understand the needs of that product or role, and it becomes, you know, a strengthening effect over time.
So I did not work in this environment, but one of the stories that I've heard going back to the frustration was a company that wanted their product managers to have a broad view of all their products. So they did that rotation of the product managers going through. It's very frustrating for the development team, because they just get the product owner trained up on what the processes were, what the rhythm was. They would just understand what the priorities were for that particular product owner, and then they get yanked out, they have somebody else come in, they have to do it all over again with different priorities and different processes. So this was more in a product development environment, not an IT environment, so I don't know if I work in an IT environment.
One point I'll make, my observation specifically ADP is that the role that the product owner came from varies widely, but what really matters is they got to be really passionate about the product they're working on, because if they're not passionate about it, the sprint team is definitely not going to be passionate about it.
Yeah, I mean, we can all agree that product management, product ownership role is a pretty unique role and requires a pretty diverse skill set. I'm not sure I want to get into the whole discussion of where does that position reside in an organization. That may be a whole other session, because we're basically down to the last 10 to 15 minutes. And I want to make sure I allot enough time for any questions that you guys have. So I know I feel like maybe I'm extracting teeth a little bit, but I know there's got to be questions or thoughts, or maybe you guys have some insight that we've missed. in addressing some of these things. Jeff? No? Software for beer distributors? Sorry. Inside joke. Any, yeah, let me bring my.
Might have been, didn't want to go much further, but with respect to where the roles reside and how they're separated, my organization is about 6 months into a new structure where we've separated out product owners and product managers as separate roles, just acknowledging that product managers couldn't span that whole spectrum from serving those outgoing, outward-looking, business-facing needs all the way down to tactically every day in the stand-up answering those questions of the developers. So we've split those roles and put product owners within the R&D organization and product management within the marketing organization. And that's working out, I think, really well so far. I mean, there's certainly challenges, in particular around how our product managers and product owners need to kind of then be joined at the hip, and that's I think, the area that we're struggling a little bit. But I think fundamentally that's been a really good move, benefited all parties. So just to throw that out there.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one answer to that. It depends on the marketplace you're in, the team, the culture of the organization. You know, and you think about from actual technical building of a solution to marketplace. You know, I've seen organizations that have a technical product manager, a general product manager, a product marketing manager that kind of try to cover that gamut, and the design can be any mix of things. So.
That's really interesting. I'm glad that's working. I'm interested to see 6 months from now, you know, how it continues to work. You know, there's so many boxes of what a product manager does, you know, strategic and tactical, and I usually dumb it down. If I ever get confused, I dumb it down to a couple of things. For me, it works. The product manager job is to get the right product on the shelf. It's very, you know, you're listening to the market in all the ways we described. And then the product marketing folks, sometimes known as Marcom, their job is to get the product off the shelf. So if you did nothing more than separate those two, now we've seen, at least from my seat, I've seen a product manager be a product owner as well. But you have to limit their scope because you will kill them for all the reasons you guys mentioned. So, you know, I've seen again in our place, you can't have a PO for more than 2 sprint teams. Absolutely top. 1 would be ideal. No more than 2. And those sprint teams have to have a fair amount of affinity. Or else there's just so much overhead and context switching where you'll kill that person. But as I've seen it and as I've been hiring, I'm hiring product managers. By the way, we're hiring product managers. So if you go to adp.com, we're hiring devs also. We're hiring in general for everybody their own things. Anyway, what I found works for me so far, and it's still a grand experiment, is I hire product managers. They in turn become a product owner, you know, for never any more than 2 sprint teams, but they have no responsibility for product marketing and Marcom, all the outbound crap, the vitally important outbound crap, trade shows and glosses and all that stuff that we need to produce is a different organization.
Well, and if I can add, it's a different skill set. I mean,
Exactly,
It
Frank,
really
yeah.
is, starting with what are, you know, the 3 T's, that transparency, truth-telling, trust. You know, that's not inherent in product marketing. Put it out there.
I'm shocked.
But it is a, you know, not just the product development, but it's also those personal skills and the guys that put it on the shelf have a whole different way of operating. And I think you really, because we failed initially because, as Dave said, we had that chasm between our product group and our development group, our R&D organization. And we thought, well, now we'll just do this. Well, those skills didn't transfer real well in terms of taking on the tenets of Agile. And I think that's making that switch for us and realizing, coming to that realization, that and co-location has made a huge difference.
Yeah, good. I think we're agreement that different people need different roles. I think there's broader organization / strategy questions everybody needs to address in your company. If you want to be a market-driven company, a market-focused company, having the product owner sit in grooming sessions and stand up and expect them to be market experts and go out and visit customers and trade shows and analyze competitors, I don't see it happening. I've never seen a person be successful taking that broad of a role. Now, David separated product marketing, product management, and product ownership. And a lot of companies group product management and product marketing. So this is, you just need to lay out the spectrum. Now, here's what we're trying to accomplish at the company for our product line, and then break the roles down and make sure that it's structured where everybody can be successful. I don't think there's a right or wrong. If we're an IT company and the customers are right next door, and you might have a product owner that can go down the street, get intimate with them, and be fine as a product owner and a product management and a product marketer. But most companies, you have to think about it broader than that.
Can I add to that, Dorian? David mentioned earlier pragmatic marketing, and I'm not a salesman for pragmatic marketing tool sets, but I'm a follower of much of it over the years. And if you look at the pragmatic marketing, I don't know what they call that, that big chart that splits all the functional things out, they delineate it between tactical and strategic. So, which is a slightly different way of thinking than product management, product ownership, or product marketing. So what are the things that are strategic in nature? And really, somebody mentioned Marcom. Marketing is different than Marcom. Marketing can be very strategic. What markets, where should we be positioned? How do we go after them? Who do we partner with? That kind of stuff. Versus the outbound Marcom stuff that you mentioned. And then there's the tactical side, which I mentioned earlier, technical product management. Everything from UX to taking user stories and starting to draft. Anyway, I think it's different in all organizations, and I'd be curious, beyond the couple of people that spoke, how else, in what other ways has that kind of set of functions mapped out in your organizations?
Where do they put project management now that they're at?
Well, now that makes the question even more difficult. Does anybody want to share how they do it in their organization and how well it's working? Or maybe the question is, what is a large failure in that regard that somebody's experienced as far as a company trying to do something one way and it fell on its face? We have a shy audience.
Nobody wants to volunteer that one, Jeff.
Well, I mean, we all become stronger and more seasoned by our failures, right? If you never failed, how do you know how strong you really can be? So, I'm not shy about my failures. Any other thoughts from the panel on the roles and where they're situated within organizations?
Great topic for a follow-up session.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Not on that topic. I work for Intel. Fundamentally, we don't, McAfee does software, but we kind of work with software partners to take advantage of our hardware, which is why I wanted to hear more about how fast software iterates and that sort of thing. But what I find we don't do well, so failures, is we don't look at the end user experience enough. And so I'm curious, I heard someone touch on business process, and I didn't know if you meant business process from the dev side or business process from the end user perspective. Because in my role, I look a lot at, or trying to look a lot at what the business process is and how we can overlay that on top of the technology. And so I'm curious from a software perspective, how do you integrate that through Agile? So that, like I was telling Carl, if you built a car for people and everyone in the world was left-handed, but you put the key on the right side, you missed the mark on the process they used to drive the car.
Okay.
By business process, you mean the market requirements, business requirement, how that gets put into the Agile process?
No. Literally, how the end user will use the product.
Yeah.
So in an antivirus, do they kick off the virus scan, or is it automatic? Do they schedule it, or how do they install it? So what's the experience for actually deploying and then day-to-day use, the last cycle? How you overlay that into development?
I think we touched on it, the general process, and that's why part of the record spec we use the word UX, right?
I heard it touched on.
Yeah. The design team, we didn't talk about how the design team integrates with Agile, right? And I touched on my recommendation. The design team is really part of the product definition, the product planning team, and they have to be way ahead of the development team. So that's back to the fact they are the fast prototypers in that case, right? They always have to be one sprint minimum, and I like 2 or 3 sprints ahead, where you're working through the business processes, the customer flow, the experience you're trying to create, and specific designs and wireframes. You don't go into grooming without a wireframe or design, is my bottom line. You have to work through all those business issues and you have a roadmap, right? You have iterations, and then design has to be done 1 or 2 iterations before the other ones, or you can't go into grooming. So that has to be part of the process.
So it's done as part of the user story
Well, yeah, sorry.
in design?
Yeah, any user story that when it gets into grooming, and this is like where Rally Dev comes in and other tools, the user story has to come with a graphic, or should, or it's not defined. It can't go into grooming without, what do you mean by the user story? It has to go to the point where it's designed, the dev team to look at it and go, that's what you meant. This is the graphics I need to create. This is the user flow I need to create. And on top of that is the acceptance criteria has to be laid out. And the acceptance criteria is based on the business requirements and flow. So I think one of the underutilized tools of contracts between product management, product ownership, and dev is acceptance criteria. How is this thing good enough? This user flow, this UX, this experience good enough? If it's not the acceptance criteria, where is it going to be? And that's where we're using customers flowing through. Because customers are your ultimate acceptance criteria. So it's not hard, it's not easy, right? But it gives you that chance for that closed loop on a much faster cycle than waterfall. But all that business stuff has to be ahead of the dev team. Have setting your minimum 1 sprint, target 2, priority 3. We'll go reverse that.
I would also add that, we talk a lot about MRDs, requirements documentation. Business process has to be a part of that. So the product management team needs to be working together, whether it's a client or you can set up a customer advisory board where you have key clients that meet quarterly or whatever, and you validate these types of things with them, business process flow. When you're doing discovery and validation of a user story, or the requirements that will lead to a user story, the business process has to be a part of it. It's not just user requirements, it's market requirements, business requirements, process requirements, all those things really need to be taken into account when developing really good requirements. So,
It's also helpful to hear where the sprints that it falls, because often I'm trying to intercept those, right? Like, because we plan so far ahead, I'm trying to intercept and say, hey, new technology coming, and I want to get in on that place you set in the phase at the right time.
One point I'll make too is that it's iterative. So you use the McAfee example. If you need to go out and you need to not talk to the customers, but watch them using the product. Because if you talk to them, you're going to get a totally different view than watching them go through it. So they tell you, well, I really need this feature. I don't like the way that it works. But in reality, if you watch them use the product, either by watching them use it physically or using some sort of heat mapping technology, which is where you can actually see the flow they're going through using your product, you can actually understand, well, we have it so that, for instance, you can right-click on the little icon in the taskbar, but nobody's doing that. So maybe we got to change the process because everyone thinks you got to double-click, go through this screen to get to that part of the application.
I want to do a plug for a book, a really old school book, which existed before UX existed as a title. It's called Don't Make Me Think. It was written in 2000 for Web 2.0. Okay, and then it was updated in 2010, I think. Anyway, it's a really thin book, $10, like for the Kindle version, maybe 15 for the paperback. Fast read, and it's about all the stuff that Justin was talking about, but it's a simple read, and it's written by an engineer who, again, even before UX became its own career path now, and has this level of sophistication that we have now, it's terrific because it talked about all that stuff about what people will go through. And by the way, the other nemesis a lot of us have is how to do usability testing on the cheap. Because usability testing, one of those things that terrifies people because it can cost, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. It doesn't have to. So it's a really fun book.
Maybe a pet peeve. I think it's one of the areas where Agile lost its way or it's misunderstood maybe. Well, I understand and read the Agile Manifesto. The whole point was that code is easy to do. It's hard, it's easy to fix. So let's do it, get it in front of customers and then fix it. I don't think Agile's really done that way much today. we're assuming that once it gets into a user story and it's done, it's kind of done. We don't really get it in front of customers and say we're going to fix it. But the whole point of Agile was to do it quick, get it in front of customers, and then fix it. And I'm guilty as a product manager that once it's done, I don't want to redo it because I got other user stories I want to create. So I think Agile needs to, we need to work through that as a world.
We basically have 5 more minutes, and I know somebody's has a burning question, and I want to get to one last question, so I'll bring this back for you.
It's a little bit related to these questions here. When we have a business analyst, on our team who is, his responsibility is work with our product manager, and they basically try to stay 1 or 2 sprints ahead to develop and work with like user focus groups to figure out what's going to be like what we're developing, so that by the time we get to the user story that's put on the sprint, the developer knows exactly what font, what it's going to look like, where the buttons are going to go. There's no churn in terms of making it go back and forth. And that. The thing that we kind of wrestle with, they are also the product manager and the business analyst are kind of responsible for writing that acceptance criteria into the user story. And so part of the time, our difficulty we find sometimes with it, especially complex stories, is sometimes that's not getting documented or turned over in the user story. And we use FitNest to to have automated acceptance tests. So it really saves our bacon a lot, because when we do a lot of refactoring or adding new features, we can run that test and immediately if something is broken, some existing piece of functionality. So I was wondering if anybody had any feedback on how do you kind of capture that acceptance criteria. We've tried collaboration between the product managers and QA and development. And sometimes we just, if we know a particular feature is very good, we might sit down and have a small brainstorming session where we try and weed all those out and try and identify how we know we're really done with that story.
Thoughts from the panel?
So who owns it? The buck stops somewhere. So acceptance criteria, somebody has to own, I think our battery's dying. Think about it. Is this working at all? So who owns, so the buck has to stop somewhere, right?
Our product manager.
Your product manager.
Has the final say. And so what happens, the frustration that occasionally pops up is, the developer gets the story, they coded it, we've had 2 code reviews on it, it's gone through testing, and then the product manager gets it and says, oh, well, what about this?
Right, so shame on the product manager, one, right? That work should have been done up front, relatively complete. The product manager should do the homework on acceptance criteria coming from all the different angles. That's their job, is munching that. And you could argue that's the product owner role. I'll let you guys debate that. But the buck has to stop somewhere. But there definitely has to be some forgiveness and understanding that, and the product manager has to understand this. Look, this was the acceptance criteria we accepted going into that sprint. And the whole point is, look, we accepted that, it's good enough. The product manager saw it and said, you know what, after I see it, and this is my pet peeve with development, is that I'm allowed as product manager that once I see it and it's not good enough, I want more, I want different, I want you to change, I want you to fix it. But it's also, I have to accept that it's going to go into the next sprint. I have to reprioritize it with all the other user stories. That's the whole point of Agile. So that's the trusted relationship give and take, that you need to be fairly clear with the acceptance criteria. Everybody has to be rational and reasonable, and if it takes more work to do it, it might have to go into the next sprint. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but the buck has to stop somewhere. Someone has to own it. Somebody has to say it's good enough. They should, and they have to figure that out and realize if they didn't get it right, I'm sorry. It's going to take another sprint to fix it, and then maybe it takes another sprint. I don't know. That help?
So, again?
What secret did you do?
Yeah, I think we're about to switch back. So one of the things that we've done, I've done in a company is pair the tester with the product owner. Because typically the product owner is not going to have the expertise to come up with reasonable tests that are going to be clear and executable by the development team. So pairing those two together, merge those two skills and allows them to come up with a reasonable acceptance test. And then, as Dorian was saying, you can get into that, well, that's not quite what I had in mind, so next iteration I'm going to put this in. But you have to train the product owners about how to write the tests, and that's a challenging thing for them, so it helps to pair them with a tester who's got that expertise.
I mean, a lot of it on user experience, it's really hard to know what's good enough. You know, is 0.3 second response time good enough? I have no idea until I experience it. Is that color and that shape good enough? I have no idea until I see it. I mean, that's the beauty of Agile, is that you have to plan for that flexibility, and then it's qualitative. You can't write it on a piece of paper. You got to see it and experience it. That takes time, iterations, trust, shared responsibility, all those things. Agile, great. That's why I love Agile. You can have that argument in 2 weeks instead of 6 months.
And it's not as big an argument.
And it's a smaller argument, right? And you get used to arguing in productive ways versus,
collaborating is the word you're looking for.
This used to be the Motorola salute when I worked there, right?
That's what it happens.
Yeah, and Agile fixes that and made it like that.
So we've run right up on our 8:10 finishing time, so we'll conclude it right where we just ended right there. I don't know if Ben or Skip has kind of a final
Yeah, I
comment.
wanted to thank all the presenters, Adam, Dave, Justin, Dave, and Dorian for spending an evening not drinking in an Irish pub. But of course, it's always downstairs. And thanks for taking time away from your families tonight. And especially Jeff. You're a venerable man with a mic. And thanks for keeping things rolling and conversations going. Just a reminder to fill out all of your surveys. We're going to collect those shortly after Skip does his magic thing. And that's it.
I'll be really quick. So I want to thank our sponsors again, Rally, Salesforce.com, and Apple. Also wanted to mention that it was a really great collaboration tonight with PDMA, and look forward to doing more of them in the future. Future events. We have the Orphan Technology Awards program coming up April 25th at the Portland Art Museum. We're expecting over 500 technology professionals at that event. You can register, get tickets online at techoregon.org. There's one deadline coming up, which is the Technology Company of the Year and Coolest Product of the Year. The deadline is February 18th. Tech Ignite is coming up May 16th. We're going to do another one of those. It's usually a very popular event. The speaker submission process is going to start in early February, so please keep an eye out for that. So thank you all for coming tonight. Hope you had a good time for the discussion. Thank you to our panelists again. Missing.
Let's do